Part 1. Why you wouldn't survive a day in ancient Rome, guys. Tonight, let's do something a little strange. Dim the lights, get cozy, and don't worry, there's no quiz at the end. We're not here to learn for the sake of learning. We're here to drift through history like a slow river. A river that sometimes smells faintly of sewage. Which is kind of perfect, since tonight, we're wandering into the streets of ancient Rome. Now, a lot of people have this idea of Rome as marble temples, heroic senators in pristine white togas, and Julius Caesar strutting around like some ancient action hero. And sure, if you were rich, connected, and possibly the emperor's favorite nephew, maybe your life looked a little bit like that. But if you were a normal person, just a regular Roman, you wouldn't last very long. Actually, you'd probably give up by lunchtime. So let's float into the world of ancient Rome. And let me tell you, you wouldn't survive a day. First, let's start with your morning. You wake up in your Roman apartment. Sounds glamorous, right? Except Roman apartments were called insulae, and they were basically the ancient equivalent of poorly constructed tenement housing. Picture a tall, wooden, fire-prone box crammed full of people. Think Airbnb, but with rats and a much higher risk of collapsing on your head. If you were lucky, you might live on the lower floors, where it was cooler and slightly safer. If you were unlucky, you were up on the 5th or 6th story, where the stairs felt like a vertical marathon and the roof leaked every time it rained. No elevators, no fire escapes, just you, your neighbors, and a collective prayer that today wasn't the day someone's cooking fire got out of hand. You stumble out of bed, probably a straw mattress, itchy and lumpy, and head to the latrine. Except, oh wait, you don't actually have a latrine. Not in your apartment. Not unless you're weirdly rich. So what do? You grab a chamber pot, do your business, and then like many Romans you dump it out the window straight into the street below. Surprise for whoever's passing by. Ancient Rome, the original splash zone. And that's how your day begins. You haven't even had breakfast yet, and you're already knee-deep in the sanitation nightmare of one of the biggest cities in the ancient world. Now, you might be thinking, okay, fine, let's grab some food. How bad can Roman breakfast be? Well, it depends on your social status. If you're rich, congratulations. You get bread with honey, fruit, maybe some olives, possibly even cheese. It's a Mediterranean brunch dream. If you're poor, which is most people, your breakfast is bread, just bread, dry, hard bread, maybe dipped in a little cheap wine. Because why not start your day buzzed when your city smells like a sewer? And before you imagine some rustic bakery loaf, no. Roman bread for the poor was often gritty, full of stone dust from badly milled flour. Eat enough of it and your teeth will literally grind down. Archaeologists have found Roman skeletons with teeth worn flat from eating their daily bread. So if the dysentery doesn't get you, the dental pain probably will. But hey, at least you've eaten. Sort of. So you head out into the city. Maybe you've got work to do. Maybe you're just wandering. Because let's be real, jobs were not always guaranteed. Rome was huge, crowded, and bursting with people from all over the empire. Immigrants, freed slaves, merchants, beggars. The streets are narrow, noisy, and completely clogged with traffic. And when I say traffic, I don't mean cars. I mean ox carts, donkeys, and thousands of sandals all shuffling around. Oh, and those chamber pots. Remember how people dump them out the window? Yeah, that's happening too. So as you wander, you're dodging carts, stray animals, and the occasional splash of raw sewage. You know how Rome is always depicted with these glorious marble buildings? Well, of the city wasn't marble. It was brick, wood, plaster, and graffiti. Lots of graffiti. Romans loved to write on walls. Political slogans, crude jokes, declarations of love. Or my personal favorite, I wonder, a wall that you have not yet collapsed under the weight of so much writing. So even back then, people were basically roasting each other in public bathrooms. Just with a chisel instead of Twitter. At this point in your day, you might want to grab some water. Except, careful, Rome did have aqueducts and public fountains, which is great. Running water in the ancient world. Impressive. But the pipes were often made of lead. Actual, real lead. which means you're hydrating yourself and slowly poisoning yourself at the same time. And honestly, that's if you're lucky enough to be near a fountain. A lot of people just scooped water out of the Tiber River, which was, to put it politely, disgusting. Imagine a river that is part garbage dump, part open sewer, and part sacred symbol. People threw offerings in, washed clothes in it, and also dumped waste into it. And then they drank from it. Cheers.so, now you're hydrated, and possibly full of lead. Good for you. Let's float into lunchtime. If you're wealthy, this is when your day really shines. Romans of high status loved to lounge on couches while slaves brought them endless courses of exotic food. Peacocks, oysters, flamingo tongues. Because why eat something normal when you can eat the tongue of a tropical bird? It's the ancient equivalent of ordering the most ridiculous item on the menu just to prove you can. If you're poor, again, things are a little less luxurious. Lunch might be some more bread, maybe a handful of olives, maybe a thin vegetable stew. Meat was rare, unless it was some questionable street sausage that you'd probably regret immediately. And if you couldn't afford lunch, well, then you just didn't eat. By afternoon, you're probably tired, cranky, and still hungry. The streets are hotter, noisier, and smellier. Let's say you try to get to the forum, the political and social heart of the city. You'd find lawyers shouting, merchants bargaining, and orators droning on about civic duty. You might even catch a glimpse of the emperor's statues, many of which were swapped out constantly. Because Rome had a bit of a habit of murdering or exiling emperors, and then pretending they'd never existed. One day, the statue is there. The next, it's gone. Rome invented cancel culture, but with chisels. Let's fast forward to evening. Maybe you're invited to a dinner party. Congratulations. This is your chance to eat something other than dusty bread. But Roman dinner parties were a whole thing. Imagine lying down on a couch, propped on one elbow, trying to look dignified while balancing a plate of food. Not great for digestion, but very chic. And the conversations? They could go anywhere. Philosophy, politics, gossip, poetry. Also, sometimes people just brought gladiators to fight in the courtyard for entertainment. Because nothing says bon appetit like someone bleeding next to the salad. Now, maybe you're not invited anywhere. Maybe you're just heading home. The sun's setting, and here's the fun part. Rome had no streetlights. The streets at night were pitch dark and dangerous. Thieves, drunkards, and wild dogs roamed freely. If you had to go out, you brought a torch and a few friends. And even then, you were probably taking your life in your hands. Back in your insula, you climb those endless stairs, try not to trip, and collapse into your straw mattress. The city hums around you, fires crackling, neighbors arguing, someone's chamber pot hitting the cobblestones below. And that's one day in ancient Rome. If you've made it this far without food poisoning, lead poisoning, or being mugged in a dark alley, congratulations. You're tougher than most, but would you want to do it all again tomorrow? Probably not. And that, my friends, is why you wouldn't survive a day in ancient Rome. Part 2. Rome wasn't built for your hygiene, so you've survived your first day in Rome. Sort of. You've dodged the chamber pots, chewed your gritty bread, and maybe even avoided being mugged in the forum. But now, we have to talk about hygiene. Because Rome has this reputation: big aqueducts, fancy baths, sparkling marble. And yes, they did have public baths that make modern spas look kind of underwhelming. But before you picture a wellness retreat with eucalyptus steam rooms and soft towels, let's actually drift into the steamy, slightly questionable world of Roman hygiene. The Romans loved their baths. And by loved, I mean they were obsessed. Big, sprawling bathhouses called thermae were basically the social hubs of the city. You didn't just go there to wash yourself, you went to gossip, do business deals, read poetry, maybe even watch a performance. So, imagine your local gym, but with fewer treadmills and a lot more naked strangers hanging out in steamy rooms. Now, here's the catch. Bathhouses were public, very public, which meant they were crowded, noisy, and not necessarily the cleanest places in the world. The Romans had hot pools, cold pools, and warm pools. Which sounds nice, until you realize there's no chlorine. Just hundreds of sweaty Romans rotating through the same water all day long. And the soap situation? There was no Dove, no lavender-scented body wash. Instead, Romans rubbed themselves with oil, then scraped it off with a tool called a strigil, which, yes, did remove dirt and sweat, but mostly smeared it into a nice little oil and grime mixture that just kind of lingered on your skin. You'd scrape it off, hand the dirty oil to a slave, and maybe they reused it, because of course they did. Now, let's talk about the other end of hygiene. The toilets. Yes, Rome had public toilets, and they were impressive in their own way. Long stone benches with holes, lined up in rows. No privacy, no stalls. Just you, your toga, and 20 of your closest neighbors, all taking care of business side by side. And when you were done, no toilet paper. Instead, Romans used a tersorium. That's a sponge on a stick. A communal sponge on a stick. You'd rinse it in a bucket of water or vinegar, give it a swish, and then pass it along for the next guy. And people wonder why intestinal parasites were basically a Roman fashion accessory. Honestly, it's a miracle anyone survived it all. But let's say you do pick up an infection. You get sick. You need a doctor. Well, congratulations, you've just entered another circle of ancient misery. Roman medicine was a mix of Greek theory, folk remedies, and good old-fashioned guesswork. Doctors believed in balancing the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were sick, it was because your humors were out of whack. Solution: bleeding you with leeches, or giving you something to vomit or purge the problem away. In other words, if the disease didn't kill you, the treatment probably would. And let's not even get into Roman surgical instruments. Archaeologists have found scalpels, hooks, forceps, even bone drills. Now, picture those tools with no anesthesia and no sterilization. Your best hope was that the doctor got bored halfway through and decided you were fine. Still feeling like Rome was glamorous? Let's float into fashion. Togas. Everyone thinks togas were this elegant, effortless garment. In reality, togas were a nightmare. They were huge, up to 18 feet of wool wrapped around your body in a very specific, very complicated way. If you put it on wrong, everyone knew you were an amateur. And they were hot, heavy, and impractical. You couldn't move easily, you couldn't work in them, and you definitely couldn't go to the bathroom without a whole logistical plan. Most people didn't even bother with togas. They wore tunics, which were basically long shirts. Togas were for citizens showing off at official events, which means the only time you had to wear one was when you least wanted to. Think of it like putting on a tuxedo just to walk to the DMV. Float over to food again. Because Roman dining wasn't just about eating, it was about showing off. The elite threw banquets where the goal was less about enjoying food and more about proving you could out-weird everyone else. Peacock brains, stuffed dormouse, honey-glazed flamingo, because nothing says sophistication like serving your guests a bird they can't even find on the same continent. And here's a fun detail: vomitoriums. People like to joke that Romans had special rooms for vomiting so they could eat more. That's not true. The word actually referred to the exit passages in amphitheaters. But that doesn't mean Romans didn't vomit on purpose. They absolutely did. You'd overeat, excuse yourself, lighten the load, and come back for round two. Because when your empire stretches across half the known world, why not gorge yourself until you're sick? Of course, not everyone had access to flamingo tongues and peacock brains. The average Roman diet was much simpler. Bread. Pulse, basically a porridge made of grains, lentils, beans, olives. Meat, if you were lucky. Fish if you were near the coast. And always wine. But don't picture fine red wine swirling in a crystal glass. Most Roman wine was cheap, sour, and had to be watered down before drinking. Sometimes they flavored it with honey herbs or even seawater, because nothing complements your porridge like a glass of saltwater wine. Now, let's drift into the Roman class system. Because who you were in Rome dictated everything. Your clothes, your food, your hygiene, even your name. If you were a senator or equestrian, life was cushy. You had villas, slaves, fancy banquets. If you were a freedman, you were technically free, but still carried the shadow of slavery. If you were a slave, well, your day depended entirely on your master. Some slaves lived almost like middle-class workers. Others lived in brutal conditions, working in mines or fields where survival was basically optional. And the scary part, you could be enslaved for all sorts of reasons. Captured in war, born into slavery, or just unlucky enough to fall into debt at the wrong time. Freedom was not a guarantee. Now, because I don't want you lying awake too much, let's gently drift into Roman entertainment. Because even after your miserable day, you still need something to do. Rome had theaters, circuses, gladiator games. Crowds packed into the Colosseum to watch animals fight, gladiators clash, and sometimes just random executions in between. It wasn't a quiet evening at the cinema. It was loud, bloody, and honestly, smelled bad. Thousands of people crammed together under the hot sun, eating snacks, shouting insults, throwing things. And yet, for the Romans, this was peak entertainment. The emperor himself might show up to watch, waving to the crowd, pretending he actually cared about their opinion. Bread and circuses, they called it. As long as people had food and entertainment, they wouldn't complain too much about politics. So the games weren't just fun, they were strategy. Keep the masses distracted, and no one notices the empire slowly rotting from within. By now, you've had your fill of Roman food, Roman fashion, Roman doctors, and Roman entertainment. You've seen the good, the bad, and the lead poisoned ugly. And the funny thing is, through it all, Romans just kept going. They built an empire, brick by brick, aqueduct by aqueduct, chamber pot by chamber pot. But for you, a modern visitor, one day was probably enough. Your teeth hurt from the bread, your stomach hurts from the wine, your lungs hurt from the smoke-filled streets, and your soul hurts from the sponge on a stick. And you still have the rest of the empire to survive. Part 3. Roman families and other disasters. So far, you've survived Roman bread, Roman chamber pots, and even the sponge on a stick experience. Congratulations, that already puts you in the top 10% of resilient time travelers. But Rome wasn't just a city of smelly streets and questionable hygiene. It was also a city of families. And let's be honest, Roman families were complicated. Let's start with Roman childhood. If you were born in Rome, your very first challenge was simply being accepted, because Roman fathers had the legal right to reject their newborns. Yes, really. Here's how it worked. The baby was laid at the father's feet. If he picked it up, congratulations, you're in the family. If he didn't, well, you were exposed, which meant left outside somewhere, often on a hillside, to die, or in some cases, to be picked up by strangers and raised as a slave. So, from day one, life was kind of a coin toss, and people wonder why Roman philosophers spent so much time brooding about fate. But let's say you were accepted. What was childhood like? In short, brief, Roman children weren't exactly treated like modern kids. There were no playrooms, no Montessori schools, no baby on board stickers. If you were a boy from a wealthy family, you might learn reading, writing, and rhetoric. If you were a girl, you learned how to run a household, weave cloth, and prepare for marriage. Toys existed, sure, dolls, balls, wooden animals. But most kids were mini-adults by the age of 7 or 8. Work, chores, and, if you were unlucky, small-scale slave duties if you were born into servitude. And forget about teenage rebellion. Your father had patria potestas, absolute power over you. Technically, he could even kill you if you misbehaved. Though in practice, most dads probably just yelled a lot and made you scrub amphory. Speaking of fathers, Roman marriage was its own chaotic system. Marriage wasn't really about romance. It was about alliances, property, and producing legitimate heirs. You didn't marry the person you loved. You married the person your parents thought would be politically useful, and the age gap could be uncomfortable. It wasn't unusual for a girl to be married off at 12 or 13 to a man in his 30s or 40s, because nothing says domestic bliss like your new husband being old enough to be your father's drinking buddy. Wives were expected to be obedient, virtuous, and very good at weaving. Husbands, meanwhile, could do pretty much whatever they wanted. Mistresses, affairs, visits to brothels, it was all tolerated, as long as they kept up appearances at home. And yet, Roman women weren't entirely powerless. Some became wealthy landowners, patronesses of the arts, or political influencers. Others, like Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus, were rumored to have poisoned half their family tree just to keep their sons in power. So, yes, Roman family dinners were tense. Now, let's drift into work life. Because, believe it or not, most Romans didn't spend their days lounging in marble villas. They worked hard. The city ran on labor, and that labor came from every corner of the social pyramid. Slaves worked in households, fields, mines, and workshops. Freedmen ran small businesses, bakers, butchers, tavern keepers. Citizens might serve in the army, work in construction, or try their luck as lawyers and teachers, and Roman work wasn't exactly cushy. The mines, for example, were notorious death traps. Slaves sent there had a life expectancy of months, not years. Meanwhile, construction workers risked collapsing scaffolding, falling bricks, or just the general chaos of building something enormous out of concrete. No one fully understood yet. Even trades that sound safe had their downsides. Bakers, for instance, worked all night to have bread ready for the morning rush, which means their lungs were full of flour dust and their circadian rhythms were permanently wrecked. So, when you bite into that gritty Roman loaf, remember someone basically coughed their way through making it. And then there was military service. For Roman men, this was the fast track to status and citizenship. But it was also brutal. 20 years in the legions, marching across Europe, building roads, fighting barbarians, sleeping in tents. Glorious in theory, exhausting in reality. The pay wasn't great, but at least you got the occasional plunder. If you survived, you might retire with a little farm. If not, well, Rome would send a nice letter home. Mating. Now, because this is Rome, we can't skip the emperors. If you want a real sense of how dysfunctional Roman family life could get, just look at the imperial household. Take Caligula, famous for being unhinged. He declared himself a living god, tried to make his horse a consul, and spent money like a teenager with a stolen credit card. He also executed family members left and right. Because why stop at dysfunction when you can have paranoia? Or Claudius, who was ridiculed for his limp and stutter, only to become emperor almost by accident after Caligula was assassinated. He spent his reign trying to be taken seriously, while his wives plotted against him. One of them, Agrippina the Younger, allegedly poisoned him with mushrooms so her son Nero could take the throne. And then there's Nero himself. If family drama had a mascot, it would be Nero. He married his stepsister, allegedly killed his mother, and then spent most of his reign performing as an actor and musician. Romans didn't mind a bit of entertainment, but they drew the line at emperors hogging the stage. Imagine if your president quit politics to go full-time karaoke. That was Nero, but let's not give all the spotlight to the men. Roman women could be just as dramatic. Julia, the daughter of Augustus, was famous for her scandals. Her father tried to present himself as a model of morality, while she snuck around Rome with a parade of lovers. Eventually, Augustus got so fed up that he exiled her to a barren island, where she lived out her days in very unglamorous solitude. Then there was Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius. She was infamous for her affairs, so infamous that ancient writers claim she once competed with a prostitute to see who could sleep with more men in a single night. Spoiler: the sources say Messalina won, which may not be true, but the fact that Romans believed it tells you everything about how her reputation went. Meanwhile, ordinary families were just trying to get by. Parents hoped their children survived childhood illnesses. Wives hoped their husbands didn't divorce them for political reasons. And everyone hoped their house didn't collapse, burn down, or get demolished to make way for some senator's new villa. Family life wasn't cozy. It was pragmatic. Children were heirs. Marriages were alliances. And affection, if it happened, was a nice bonus, not a guarantee. And yet, despite all this, Romans still managed to leave behind love poetry. tender epitaphs, and little wax dolls tucked into graves. Beneath the politics and the scandals, people still cared. They loved, they grieved, they hoped. Even if their version of parenting started with, "Do I even want to keep this baby?" So, if you thought surviving Roman hygiene was tough, imagine surviving Roman family life. Your father controls your fate. Your spouse may poison you, and your emperor might set the city on fire just to write a poem about it. And that's just another day in the eternal city. Part 4. Gods, Omens, and other ancient hedichesso. You've survived Roman bread, Roman families, and possibly Roman emperors trying to marry their horses. Congratulations! You're still alive in the eternal city. But now, let's talk about something that shaped almost every moment of Roman life: religion. Because if you think Roman families were complicated, wait until you meet their gods. Romans didn't really believe in one big, cozy god who looked after them. They believed in everything. Gods for the sky, gods for the rivers, gods for door hinges, gods for moldy bread. If you could name it, Rome probably had a deity for it. Take Cardia. She was the goddess of door hinges. Yes, hinges. Because nothing says divine power like making sure your door doesn't squeak. Or Cloacina, the goddess of the sewer system. Imagine lighting incense and saying a little prayer every time you flushed your chamber pot out the window. That was Rome. And these weren't just abstract beliefs. Romans lived their lives around rituals, sacrifices, and omens. If you were starting a business, you sacrificed a chicken. If you were going on a trip, you sacrificed another chicken. And if you ran out of chickens, you sacrificed whatever was handy. The Romans especially loved augury, the art of reading bird signs. Yes, bird signs. You'd watch the sky, see how the birds were flying, and interpret whether the gods approved of your plans. Imagine trying to schedule a meeting and saying, "Sorry, can't come. The pigeons flew left today." And it wasn't just birds. Priests called haruspices examined the entrails of sacrificed animals. If the liver looked healthy, good omen. If it looked weird, maybe cancel your battle plans. Basically, ancient Rome ran on a mix of astrology, barbecue, and wishful thinking. Now, in the household, religion was even more personal. Every Roman family had its own little shrine called a lararium. These shrines honored the household gods, the Lares and Penates spirits who protected the home and pantry. Every day, you'd light a little fire, pour a bit of wine, and ask them to keep your bread mold-free. It sounds cozy, but it also meant that forgetting to feed your pantry gods was basically like forgetting to pay rent. Suddenly, your grain goes bad, your roof leaks, and you're convinced it's because the tiny statue on your shelf is mad at you. And then there were the festivals. Romans loved a good festival, which is a polite way of saying they loved excuses to drink too much, party in the streets, and make sacrifices until the temples smelled like a barbecue pit. One of the biggest festivals was Saturnalia. Held in December, it was basically the ancient Roman version of Christmas, but with more chaos. Slaves and masters switched places, people wore silly hats, and gambling was allowed. It was a week of role reversal, rowdiness, and general bad decisions. Picture your office holiday party, but stretched out for 7 days, and involving goats. Then there was Lupercalia. This was a fertility festival in February. Priests would sacrifice goats, strip down, and then run through the city lightly whipping people with strips of goat hide. Supposedly, if you got whipped, it made you more fertile. So, yes, Rome invented both Valentine's Day and awkward parades. But religion in Rome wasn't all fun and festivals. It was also politics. Being in charge of the priesthoods was a fast track to power. Julius Caesar himself was Pontifex Maximus, chief priest, before he was a dictator, which meant he was juggling both divine omens and civil wars, often at the same time. And emperors, they weren't just rulers. They were worshipped as gods. At least, some of them were. The Senate would decide, after an emperor's death, whether he should be officially deified. If yes, he became a god. If not, he became a very awkward memory. Imagine working your whole life, ruling the greatest empire on earth, and then the Senate basically says, You weren't divine material. And speaking of divinity, well, let's float to superstition. Because Romans were extremely superstitious. They carried charms, wore amulets, and muttered protective spells against the evil eye. Even the educated elite senators, generals, philosophers kept little trinkets to ward off bad luck. And let's not forget curses. Romans loved writing curses on little lead tablets, folding them up, and tossing them into wells or graves. May my neighbor's crops fail. May my rival trip and break his nose. May the guy who stole my sandals get a rash. Basically, the ancient version of subtweeting. Now, let's glide into the temples. If you were a Roman, temples were everywhere. Big ones for Jupiter, small ones for obscure local gods. Shrines tucked into every corner. They weren't quiet places of personal prayer. They were bustling, smoky, full of priests, sacrifices, and people asking for favors. And if you didn't participate, people thought you were suspicious, which became a big problem later when Christianity showed up and Christians refused to join in the sacrifices. But that's a story for another sleepless night. For now, stay with the traditional gods. Because Rome's pantheon wasn't just local, it was borrowed. They adopted gods from the Greeks, the Etruscans, even from conquered lands. So Venus became Aphrodite, Mars became Ars, and suddenly you had a giant mashup of deities, myths, and rituals. It was less organized religion and more spiritual buffet. And while this sounds open-minded, it also meant you had to keep track of hundreds of gods. Forget to sacrifice to one? Boom, bad harvest. Insult another? Suddenly, your trip to Gaul turns into a disaster. Basically, being in Rome meant constantly trying to keep every divine being happy, which was impossible. No wonder Romans drank so much wine.